The experts said draining the pond would destroy Rick Bryson's farm. His son threatened to sell. His neighbors called it agricultural suicide. But Rick had his grandfather's notebook with a rough sketch of the basin and 4 underlined words: "Good clay runs deep." He drained it through collapsing walls and 2 weeks of mud. Then he hit a seam of pale clay so pure the first test bought his retirement. The water table never fell. Sometimes the experts are wrong. Rick Bryson was a third-generation farmer in a valley where water was more valuable than gold. Draining the pond was supposed to kill the wells of 12 families, but Rick had his grandfather's notebook and 4 words he couldn't shake. The question was simple. What had his grandfather seen beneath the mud that justified such a gamble? The answer would change everything, and it all started with a pump running on a cold October morning. Rick had spent his entire life on that farm, 57 years of watching the seasons turn from the same kitchen window. He knew every low spot in the pasture that flooded after a hard rain, every fence post his father had set by hand. The 2-acre pond behind the barn had been there since before he was born, a dark, still mirror that his grandfather dug during the Depression to keep the livestock watered through dry summers. Over the decades, the pond had become more than a water source. It was part of the valley's hydrology, a shallow lens that held the water table high and stable across a dozen properties downstream, from the McAllen family's dairy operation to the new vineyard that had just started turning a profit on the south slope. When Rick first mentioned draining it, the county soil conservation agent drove out within the week. He stood on the bank with a clipboard, gesturing at the pond like a doctor diagnosing a terminal patient. "Pull that drain plug," he said, "and every well on this side of the valley drops by Christmas." The Farm Bureau backed him up, calling it agricultural suicide in a newsletter that went out to 400 families. Rick's son, who had been talking about taking over the land, threatened to sell his share outright if his father went through with it. Neighbors drove past slower than necessary, shaking their heads. Rick listened to all of it without arguing. He had something they didn't: a worn leather notebook he'd found in a trunk in the barn attic, tucked beneath a stack of old seed catalogs. Inside, his grandfather had sketched a cross-section of the pond basin in blue pencil, labeling the layers of soil and rock with the precision of a man who had spent his life reading the ground beneath his feet. At the very bottom, underlined 4 times in shaky pencil, 4 words: "Good clay runs deep." Rick didn't know what kind of clay, or why it mattered enough to sketch, but his grandfather had never been a man to waste ink on speculation. That notebook became the quiet anchor of his decision. So on a cold October morning, with the leaves half turned and a frost still crusting the grass, Rick fired up a diesel pump and started draining the pond alone. The water came down fast at first, a thick, brown stream spilling into the ditch he dug toward the lower pasture. By the second day, the mud was already sucking at his boots, and a retaining wall along the north edge, weakened by decades of root pressure, collapsed with a sound like a tree going down. 2 desperate weeks later, he had nothing but a stinking crater, a mounting repair bill that had already eaten through his savings, and a phone full of messages from people who wanted to say they told him so. His son stopped taking his calls. The county agent sent a formal letter warning about legal liability if neighboring wells ran dry. Rick stood at the rim of the hole one evening, the smell of sulfur and wet earth thick in the air, and wondered if he had just destroyed everything his family had built for 3 generations. Then he cut into the exposed floor with a backhoe, and everything he thought he knew about his land shifted beneath him. The first cut of the backhoe bucket into the pond floor scraped through 3 feet of black muck that smelled like a bog in August. On the second pass, the teeth caught on something solid. At first, Rick thought it was just a ledge of the old bedrock that weather maps had always shown running under the valley. But when he killed the engine and climbed down into the hole, he saw streaks of pale gray running through the dark soil like veins in marble. He scooped up a handful and pressed it between his fingers. It was slick, almost greasy, the kind of clay that held its shape when you squeezed it, not crumbled like ordinary dirt. He had never seen anything like it on the property, and he had been digging post holes on this land since he was 12. He hauled a 5-gallon bucket of the stuff up to the barn and spent the evening reading his grandfather's notebook again under the bare bulb. Among the penciled crop rotations and rainfall records, he found a loose page folded into quarters, a letter from a ceramics supply company dated 1953. It was a reply to his grandfather, who had apparently shipped a small sample of clay to them years ago. The letter thanked him for the submission but noted, with what read like strained politeness, that the clay did not meet their commercial specifications. Scribbled in the margin in his grandfather's handwriting was a single line. They only tested the top layer. Rick stared at that margin note for a long time. The next morning, he sent a sample to a materials testing lab in Raleigh, not the same one his grandfather had used, a modern facility that specialized in industrial minerals. He didn't say what he thought it might be. He didn't want to sound like a man who had just drained 2 acres of water on a hunch. He just asked them to tell him what it was. 3 weeks slipped by without a word. The crater sat silent, its exposed clay seam now drying to a dusty crust under the late autumn sun. The repair bills had climbed past $30,000. His son had formally filed to partition the land, a legal move that would force a sale if Rick couldn't buy him out. The county agent had begun monitoring the water table at 5 neighboring wells, sharing his data with the local paper. And then the lab report arrived, not by email but by certified mail, which told him before he even opened the envelope that someone thought the contents were worth confirming receipt. The report identified high-purity kaolin clay, a mineral used in porcelain, cosmetics, pharmaceuticals, and high-temperature ceramics. The purity level was over 92%, a number that put it in the top tier of commercially viable kaolin deposits in the United States. The report added a note at the bottom: geologist available for site consultation at request. Rick sat at his kitchen table and read the words 3 times before he let himself exhale. What happened next caught him entirely off guard. The lab, as a matter of routine, flagged their most significant findings to industry contacts. Within 4 days, a ceramics engineer named Dr. Miriam Cole had cleared her schedule and driven 6 hours from a research facility near the coast to see the deposit for herself. She walked the rim of the crater, took her own samples, and tested them on portable equipment she hauled out of her truck. Then she looked at Rick and asked a question no one in his life had ever thought to ask him. Would you be willing to lease extraction rights? She already had a buyer in mind, a mining company that supplied raw materials to a major porcelain manufacturer in the Carolinas. The initial numbers she sketched on a napkin in his kitchen that evening made the repair bills look like pocket change. Rick didn't sign anything that night. He told her he needed time, not because he was hesitating, but because he wanted to understand exactly what he was sitting on and what his grandfather had tried to tell the world half a century before anyone was ready to listen. But while Rick was weighing his options, word of the find leaked. A field technician at the lab told a friend, who told a cousin, who posted speculation on a local geology forum. Within a week, the county agent was fielding calls not about water tables, but about mineral rights. The same farm bureau that had called the draining agricultural suicide now sent a representative out to ask, carefully, whether Rick had considered the tax implications of a sudden windfall. Neighbors who had avoided his phone calls now knocked on his door offering congratulations, or advice, or thinly disguised offers to invest. His son stopped the partition proceedings and drove out for the first time in months, standing at the edge of the crater with his hands in his pockets, apologizing in the halting way of someone who knows an apology isn't really enough. And Rick, who had spent 2 months being the valley's cautionary tale, suddenly had everyone's attention, which was almost as uncomfortable as being ignored had been. The mining company's formal offer arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a man in a suit who had flown in from Chicago. 8 figures for exclusive extraction rights over a 20-year lease, plus a royalty on every ton of clay that left the property. The water table, it turned out, had never depended on the pond after all. The pond had been a shallow surface feature, slowly fed by groundwater moving through deeper, older fractures. Draining it had no effect on the aquifers that supplied the valley's wells. The county agent confirmed this in a quietly retracted report, and the local paper ran a story with a headline that Rick's wife cut out and kept in the family Bible. The same men who had called him reckless now asked what else they might be standing on top of without knowing it. But the biggest surprise was still waiting in a file his grandfather had left behind, one that Rick hadn't found yet. A week after the mining company's offer arrived, Rick was cleaning out the last of the barn's old storage loft, a job he had put off for years. In a rusted filing cabinet behind a stack of moldy burlap sacks, he found a second notebook, smaller than the first, bound in the same worn leather. This one had no sketches of the pond basin, no rainfall records. It was a personal journal dated from 1948 to 1954, the years his grandfather had spent trying to interest anyone in the clay beneath their feet. The entries grew progressively shorter and sharper. One from early 1950 read, "Sent another sample to Canton. They said no before they even opened the box." A later entry, underlined so hard the pencil had torn the paper, "Halliburton man came out, poked around for an hour. Told me the vein was too thin to mine commercially and I'd be a fool to try. He left with mud on his boots and never called back." Rick read the entries in order, each one a small wound inflicted decades ago, a man trying to prove value in something that the world kept dismissing. The final entry, dated just 3 months before his grandfather died, was the one that changed everything. It described a second mineral deposit located not beneath the pond, but under the old hay meadow a quarter-mile to the east, a seam of ultra-pure silica sand that his grandfather believed was even more valuable than the kaolin. He had never dug it, never had the money or the strength left, but his notes included a hand-drawn survey, compass bearings, and a line at the bottom. "One day the world will catch up to what's under this farm." Rick sat in the dusty loft, the journal trembling in his hands, and realized that the kaolin was only the beginning. The next morning, he called Dr. Miriam Cole again. She had returned to her lab near the coast but answered on the first ring. When Rick described the silica sand notation and the survey coordinates, she went quiet for a long moment, then asked if she could bring a geophysics team the following week. She didn't want to use a backhoe this time. She wanted ground-penetrating radar and a core drill, tools that could map the deposit without disturbing it until they knew what they had. Rick agreed, and the team arrived on a cold Monday with enough equipment to fill 3 pickup trucks. They set up in the hay meadow under a pale November sky, running cables across the grass while curious neighbors watched from the county road. The radar scans revealed something far larger than anyone expected, a continuous layer of high-purity quartz sand stretching across nearly 8 acres, not just under the meadow, but extending toward the old apple orchard and beyond. The initial lab analysis of a test core showed silica content above 99%, a grade so fine it was suitable for high-end glass manufacturing, electronics, and even solar panel production. Dr. Cole told Rick that she had only seen numbers like that from a handful of sites in the country, and most of those were already heavily mined. This deposit was untouched, unknown, and sitting under land that had been in his family for 4 generations. The discovery of the silica deposit doubled the mining company's interest overnight. The original offer for the kaolin rights had been generous, but now the conversation shifted to something closer to a partnership. The company wanted a comprehensive mineral lease covering the entire property, not just the pond basin. Their second offer arrived by courier, a document thick as a phone book, with provisions for upfront payments, annual royalties, and a job for Rick's son if he wanted one. But it also came with complications Rick had not anticipated. The legal language was dense, full of clauses that granted the company broad rights to expand operations, build processing facilities, and control access to parts of the farm for decades. Rick's attorney, a man from the county seat who had never handled a mineral rights case before, read the document twice and told Rick to get a specialist. That specialist, an attorney from Raleigh, cost $400 an hour and advised Rick that he was sitting on one of the most significant mineral finds in the state's recent history, and that signing the wrong deal could lock his family out of the wealth for generations. The pressure intensified from every direction. Neighbors who had once predicted ruin now formed an informal coalition, worried that large-scale mining would bring noise, dust, and truck traffic to their quiet valley. The County Planning Board announced a public hearing to discuss zoning for any future extraction operations. Environmental groups began asking questions about groundwater impacts, even though the earlier scare about the water table had been debunked. Rick's son, having abandoned the partition threat, now wanted to be involved in negotiations, seeing the property less as a family farm and more as a mineral estate. Father and son argued over how quickly to move, over whether to sell outright or retain control, over the fundamental question of what the land was actually for. The son wanted speed. Rick wanted to honor the caution his grandfather had learned at great cost. Their arguments echoed across the same kitchen table where Rick had first read the lab report, and neither man walked away satisfied. Then came the third unexpected twist. During the public hearing, a representative from a rival mining consortium showed up uninvited. He had driven from Atlanta with a competing offer that was, on paper, even more lucrative than the first company's deal. But it came with a condition. The consortium wanted exclusive rights not only to the kaolin and silica, but to any future mineral discoveries on the property, in perpetuity. That word, perpetuity, made Rick's attorney physically wince during a private consultation. The original mining company, sensing a bidding war, raised their offer again, adding a community benefits package that included a fund for local schools and a guarantee to hire locally. The Valley, which had once united against Rick's recklessness, now split into factions. Those who wanted the highest bid accepted immediately, and those who feared what rapid development would do to the place they all called home. Rick found himself caught in the middle, carrying the weight of a decision that had grown far beyond any single person's ability to easily resolve. And through it all, the journal entries kept pulling him back to his grandfather's quiet persistence, the years of rejection and that final, prophetic line. One day the world will catch up. That day had arrived. But catching up, Rick was learning, brought its own kind of storm. The question now was whether he could navigate it without losing the farm, his family, or the legacy his grandfather had buried in the dirt for someone smarter or luckier to find. Rick took 6 more weeks to make his decision, and those weeks were the quietest the farm had seen in months. He didn't hold a press conference. He didn't call the local paper. He sat down at his kitchen table with his son, his attorney, and a map of the property that his grandfather had drawn in 1947, and he started drawing lines. Those lines defined where mining would happen and where it never would. The Old Hay Meadow, the Pond Basin, and the eastern slope were zoned for extraction, but the farmhouse, the pasture where the cattle still grazed, and the original apple orchard were placed off-limits in perpetuity. The mining company from Chicago, the one that had sent the first offer, agreed to every restriction. They weren't just buying clay. They were buying a story that their own marketing team already wanted to tell, a multi-generational family farm that had uncovered hidden wealth without destroying what made it a farm in the first place. The rival consortium from Atlanta walked away when Rick refused to grant blanket rights, but by then, he didn't need them. The final agreement included an 8-figure upfront payment, a royalty stream projected to run for more than 30 years, and a community fund that would quietly underwrite scholarships for every high school senior in the county who wanted to study agriculture or geology. The mining operation employed 18 local workers in its first year, including 3 neighbors who had once stood on the county road and predicted Rick would ruin them all. Rick's son withdrew the partition filing and took a job managing the logistics for the mineral transport. He moved back into the farmhouse, and on the first Sunday after the deal was signed, he and Rick rebuilt the collapsed retaining wall together, not because it needed doing, but because it needed undoing, a small symbolic reversal of the moment when everything had seemed lost. The water table, as the county agent finally acknowledged in a dry correction notice, never fell. In fact, the deeper groundwater monitoring wells showed a slight rise in the years after the pond was drained, as the new extraction pits were lined and managed to prevent any drawdown. The same hydrologists who had warned of disaster eventually published a paper citing the Bryson farm as a case study in mistaken surface water assumptions. Rick read the paper once, nodded, and tucked it into the same trunk where he had found his grandfather's notebooks. By the second year, a small processing facility stood at the edge of the hay meadow, clean and quiet, sorting kaolin and silica into graded shipments that left the valley on rail cars that hadn't stopped there in decades. The specialty ceramics manufacturer in the Carolinas now used Bryson clay in their highest-end porcelain, and a solar panel company in California was testing the silica for next-generation photovoltaic glass. Rick didn't attend any of the ribbon cuttings. He was usually in the barn, or walking the fence line, or sitting on the porch with his wife, watching the trucks roll by and remembering the day the first pump had sputtered to life. And then, 3 years after the deal was signed, a small package arrived at the farm with no return address. Inside was a porcelain cup, thin as an eggshell, glazed in a pale gray that matched the color of the clay seam Rick had first scooped up with his bare hands. A handwritten note from Dr. Miriam Cole explained that she had fired it herself, using the very first kaolin sample she had taken from the pond basin. "This is what your grandfather saw," she wrote. "It just took the rest of us a little longer to catch up." Rick set the cup on the kitchen windowsill, next to the 2 worn leather notebooks, and left it there. He never drank from it. It was enough just to see it in the morning light. The story of the Bryson farm is, at its simplest, about a man who drained a pond against all advice and found a fortune. But that is what actually happened. What actually happened was that a man trusted someone who had been forgotten, spent 18 winters watching ice form in patterns no one else noticed, and bet everything on 4 words written in shaky pencil. He didn't get lucky. He paid attention. And the greatest reward wasn't the money, though the money changed everything. It was the moment his grandfather's journal told him, across half a century of silence, that value doesn't disappear just because the world refuses to see it. Somewhere on your property, or in your family's old papers, or under a patch of ground you've never had reason to dig up, there might be something the world has already decided isn't worth looking at. A pond no one thinks twice about. A meadow that's just been taking up space. A handwritten note in shaky pencil that someone folded and forgot. Rick Bryson's story didn't end with a contract and a porcelain cup. It ended with a question that now hangs over every acre of that valley, and maybe over wherever you happen to be right now. What else are we standing on top of without knowing it? If this story reminded you to trust the quiet persistence of someone who paid attention, hit subscribe before the screen changes. Tell us in the comments about a time you ignored the experts, or a discovery that changed the way you see your own piece of the world. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that the messiest gambles are sometimes the only ones worth taking. And as always, let us know where in the world you're watching from tonight.